You are in Seville in the year 1482. Look at that man. He walks barefoot on wet cobblestones, dragging a wooden cross that weighs almost the same as he does. He is not a convict. No one has forced him. He does it because he wants to. He does it because his entire city has spent 300 years building this ritual until it became something that no other people on earth has achieved. A tradition that fuses art, faith, and pain in a single instant that paralyzes time. That is Holy Week in Spain, and its origin is much older, darker and more extraordinary than any tourist guide has ever told you. I welcome you to the channel where you will discover the true history of Spain. My name is Diego, and I thank you for joining me in this incredible story. The Spanish Holy Week was not born in a church. It was born in a crisis, to understand how we got to the steps embroidered in gold, to the processions that take your breath away, to the sound of the saitas that rise from the early morning to the sky of Andalusia. We must go back to a moment when the medieval church was going through the greatest upheaval in its history. And Spain at that time was the laboratory where everything was experimented with first. It was the 11th century. All of Europe had been shaken for decades by something that theologians could not explain or control. People no longer believed in the same way. It is not that they had stopped believing. On the contrary, they believed with a new, personal, almost dangerous intensity. The peasants wanted to see Christ. They wanted to touch him. They wanted to understand with their eyes what the sermons in Latin denied them with their ears. It was a spiritual hunger that the official liturgy could not satisfy, and that hunger would forever transform the history of devotion in Spain. The Roman Church understood it before anyone else, and the response it gave was not to reprimand the faithful. It was to give them back the images. In the year 1229 in Spain, there were already brotherhoods, small associations of laypeople who organized themselves around a patron saint, a Marian devotion, a sacred image of their neighborhood. They were not clerics. They were artisans, merchants, fishermen, tanners, men and women who needed a community structure to face a world that offered no social protection of any kind. If you got sick, if you lost the harvest, if your family fell into ruin, the brotherhood would come. It was a system of mutualism before the word existed, and it was that system that ended up becoming the engine of the most impressive Holy Week in the world, because the brotherhoods not only took care of the living, they also prayed for the dead. And praying for the dead in the Middle Ages was a matter of such seriousness that today it is almost impossible to imagine. Purgatory as a consolidated doctrine began to take shape throughout the 11th and 12th centuries. The idea that the soul could be purified after life, that the intercession of the living could accelerate that process, created an unprecedented spiritual industry. The brotherhoods organized masses, processions, collective prayers, and for those processions they needed images that represented the suffering of Christ, the pain of the Virgin, the exact moments of the Passion, images that people could see, recognize, and feel as their own. Here enters the first great genius of the Spanish Holy Week, and it was not a priest, it was a sculptor. The Spanish processional imagery has no equivalent anywhere else in the Christian world. France has its cathedrals, Italy has its frescoes, Spain has its polychrome wood images. Figures of Christ and the Virgin sculpted with anatomical precision and an emotional charge that traversed the centuries without losing a shred of their power. That tradition started precisely in the Middle Ages, when the workshops of image makers began to work on commission for the penance brotherhoods. Each brotherhood wanted its image, and the more perfect, the more painful, the more human that image was, the more capable it was of moving the faithful to genuine contrition. This was not decoration. It was applied psychology 600 years in advance. The psychology of medieval devotion understood something that modern neuroscience has taken centuries to confirm. The body learns faster than the mind when a man sees Christ on the cross, not as an abstract symbol, but as a life-sized figure, with wounds that look open and eyes that look alive. Something happens inside him that no sermon can provoke. Empathy is activated in a visceral way, and that empathy turned into public and collective devotion is exactly what the medieval brotherhoods knew how to channel. But the Holy Week that we know today cannot be understood without a specific date, without a moment when everything changed. Year 1252, Ferdinand III of Castile, the king who finished consolidating the reconquest in the south of the peninsula, had taken Seville just 5 years earlier. The city he found was one of the richest and most densely populated in all of Europe, but also a city with an unprecedented cultural mixture. Arabs, Jews, newly converted Muslims, Castilians from the north, military orders, mendicant friars, all together in a city that no one knew yet how to govern. The public procession was the answer. Taking the images to the street was not just an act of devotion, it was a political act. It was the way in which the church and the crown demonstrated that the public space belonged to the Christian faith, that the streets of Seville were Christian streets, and that anyone who wanted to live in them had to understand the visual language of that faith. The medieval processions were simultaneously liturgy, propaganda, and spectacle. And in Seville, a city of merchants and artisans, that spectacle was refined generation after generation with the same logic with which a piece of jewelry was refined. If you plan to experience any of these processions firsthand this year, or if you simply want to keep learning about the history of Spain that does not appear in textbooks, subscribe now. Every week we publish a new chapter of this history. The step, that platform on which the processional image travels, did not start as we know it today either. It was born as a litter, a simple board carried on the shoulders of two men in the 11th century. The images were transported in an elemental, functional way, without more ornament than the flowers that the faithful threw at the step. But Seville was Seville, and in Seville the competition between brotherhoods to have the most beautiful step, the most impactful image, the most solemn route, escalated for 3 centuries until reaching levels of refinement that still today leave those who witness them for the first time speechless. That competition had an economic engine that almost no one mentions. The brotherhoods were not only associations of devotion, they were corporations. Many of them grouped the members of the same guild: the silversmiths, the carpenters, the farmers. The brotherhood was the public face of the guild, and the splendor of its procession was the announcement of its prosperity. The richer the step, the more credit the guild had before the entire city. There was a concrete economic return on every real spent on embroidery, on wax, on incense. The medieval Holy Week was also a fair for exhibiting artisanal power, and that explains why the silversmithing, embroidery, and imagery reached a technical level in Spain that has no equal in Europe. The Nazarenes did not always exist either. The figure of the hooded penitent with his tunic and his hood is so iconic of the Spanish Holy Week that many assume it is as old as Christianity itself. It is not. The first clear records of hooded penitents in the Holy Week processions in Spain do not appear until the 14th century, and their origin was not aesthetic, but practical. The hood hid the face. In medieval penance, the idea was that pain and humiliation were a sacrifice that was only worth it if it was authentic. Exhibiting yourself as a penitent before your city, before your neighborhood, before your neighbors and your commercial competitors required an anonymity that protected the sincerity of the act. If they knew it was you, the temptation to do it out of vanity was too great. If they did not know it was you, the spiritual merit was greater. The hood was not a disguise. It was a guarantee of authenticity. But there is another darker reason that medieval documents do not say openly, but that historians read between the lines. In the 14th century, the Iberian Peninsula was a deeply watched society. The Inquisition had not yet arrived in its most institutionalized form, but social control over religious practice was intense. Covering the face in a penance procession also had a function of personal protection. Extreme devotion could be as suspicious as the lack of devotion depending on who was looking and with what eyes. The 14th century was the century in which the Spanish Holy Week made the definitive leap from a local ritual to a mass phenomenon, and the reason was paradoxically the most devastating catastrophe that Europe has ever lived. The Black Death arrived on the Iberian Peninsula in the year 1348. It entered through the Mediterranean ports and advanced towards the interior with a speed that no army had managed to match. In less than 3 years, it wiped out between a third and half of the population of many Spanish cities. Seville, due to its status as a port and commercial center, was one of the hardest hit cities. It is estimated that in some neighborhoods more than 60% of its inhabitants fell in the course of months. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary phenomena of collective psychology in all the history of Spain. Faced with massive and inexplicable death, faced with the collapse of any certainty about the future, the population's response was not the abandonment of faith, it was its radical intensification. The penance brotherhoods grew exponentially. Thousands of men and women who had lost their families, their neighbors, their teachers and their apprentices joined public devotion associations as if in that collective act they found the only thing that the catastrophe could not take away from them, the belonging to something bigger than themselves. It is the moment when the Holy Week ceases to be a liturgical ritual and becomes something different, something that does not exist in any other language and that in Spanish has an exact name: experience. The medieval penance procession after the Black Death was not a parade. It was a collective therapy of proportions that we do not have tools to measure today. Thousands of people walking together in silence, carrying the physical weight of the images, feeling on their shoulders the same effort that their neighbors felt, crying in public a pain that medieval society had no other channel to express. The modern anthropologist would call it a community mourning ritual. The 14th century penitent simply called it his duty, and that duty was sedimenting in the streets of Seville, of Malaga, of Valladolid, of Zamora, generation after generation, until we reached the 15th century. The 15th century was the moment when the Catholic monarchs understood something that no European monarch had understood with such clarity. Popular devotion is not controlled by force. It is channeled with art. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon were not only the unifiers of Spain. They were the greatest patrons of the processional imagery of their time. Under their reign, the workshops of sculptors like Master Rodrigo Alaman or the anonymous Andalusian image makers received commissions from brotherhoods that competed fiercely to have the most perfect image, the most elaborate mystery, the scene of the passion most capable of provoking contrition in the viewer. It was in this century when the processional step acquired the structure that it fundamentally maintains today. Wooden platform, decorated vents, poles with candlesticks, skirts of embroidered velvet, the carriers, the costaleros in the Andalusian case, hidden under the step, invisible, moving several thousand kilos of wood, silver and wax to the beat of the foreman's orders. That system of hidden carriers is not only a technical solution, it is a perfect metaphor for the entire tradition. The invisible effort that sustains the visible beauty. Subscribe if you want us to continue exploring the chapters of this history that no one has told you. There is more to come, and we arrive at 1492. The year that changed the known world also transformed the Spanish Holy Week in a way that its protagonists could not anticipate. The expulsion of the Jews in that same year and the conclusion of the Reconquest with the capture of Granada created a new Spain, a Spain that needed to redefine its identity with urgency, a Spain that was, for the first time in almost 800 years, uniformly Christian, at least in appearance. The penance brotherhoods became the perfect instrument of that new identity. Belonging to a brotherhood was to publicly demonstrate the purity of your faith. Participating in the Holy Week processions was to exhibit before your city and the crown that you were part of the Spanish project in its new version. The processions grew in number, in pomp, in solemnity, and with them grew something that perhaps no one had planned. A tradition of artistic beauty without equivalent in Europe. Because what differentiates the Spanish Holy Week from any other Holy Week ritual in the Christian world is not the devotion. It is the art. It is the accumulation of 500 years of silversmithing, gold and silver embroidery, of polychrome wood imagery, of processional music, of clothing, of protocol. It is the fact that a medium-sized city in Andalusia can bring to the street in a single week pieces of silversmithing that are worth more than the annual budgets of many European museums. It did not happen by accident. It happened because the Spanish Holy Week was for centuries the only space in which the most brilliant artisans of Spain could exhibit their work before the widest possible audience. The image maker who carved a Christ for a Seville brotherhood was not doing a commissioned work. He was signing his masterpiece before the entire city. The 15th century was the century of consolidation. The Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 1563, responded to the challenge of the Protestant Reformation with a radical defense of sacred images as a legitimate instrument of devotion. What was being destroyed in Northern Europe was being built in Spain with renewed intensity. While the Reformists were tearing the crucifixes from the German churches, the Sevillian image makers were carving the most expressive, most human, and most powerful Christs that the history of Western art has ever produced. Juan de Mesa, Pedro de Mena, Gregorio Fernandez in Valladolid, Francisco de Zurbarán painting the canvases that were going to hang on the steps. These names are not only references of Spanish sacred art, they are the architects of the emotional experience that every Holy Week travels the streets of half of Spain, and that experience has a very precise geometry. A Holy Week procession is not a random route. Each step follows a route that in many cases has been set for centuries, street by street, corner by corner. That route is designed so that the image travels through its neighborhood, so that the neighbors who have been looking from the same balcony all their lives see their Christ or their Virgin pass at a distance they can almost touch. The human scale of the Spanish Holy Week is radical. The images are not on a distant altar where you have to look at them with binoculars. They pass 2 meters from you. You can see the glass tears on the cheek of the Virgin. You can feel the heat of the candles. You can smell the incense mixed with the orange blossom of April. That proximity is not accidental. It is the result of 7 centuries of refinement of a ritual that understood before any other that genuine emotion is not produced at a distance. It is produced in contact, and here is the hidden reason for everything. The reason that crosses 7 centuries of Spanish history and that no one mentions in tourism documentaries. The Spanish Holy Week survived wars, epidemics, revolutions, and prohibitions, not because it was a mandate of the Church, but because it responded to a fundamental human need that no institution could suppress, the need to cry together, to make private pain public, to turn individual suffering into something that makes sense because it is shared. The medieval brotherhoods that were born to bury the dead of the Black Death, and the 21st century brotherhoods that bring out their steps in Seville, in Malaga, in Cartagena, in Valladolid, are responding to exactly the same question. How do you live with the burden of what is lost? The Spanish answer, the answer that was born in the Middle Ages and that 500 generations have been perfecting until turning it into the most sophisticated in the world, is this: it is carried on shoulders, literally. The Costaleros of Seville, who carry the step of the Lord of the Sentence, carry on their cervicals a weight that exceeds 2,000 kilograms. They walk crouching, without seeing where they are going, guided only by the voice of the foreman who knocks with his knuckles on the wood from the outside. They do not see the image they carry. They do not see the street. They do not see the public. They only feel the weight and listen to the order. And in that act of total surrender, in that blind and collective effort that no one from the outside can appreciate because it is hidden under the velvet skirts, is all the practical theology of the Spanish Holy Week condensed into its purest form to carry what cannot be seen, to advance without knowing exactly where, to trust that the group will reach its destination because everyone does their part. That is what Spain learned in the Middle Ages, and that is what it has been teaching for 7 centuries to whoever stops to look. The next time you are on a Spanish street during Holy Week and the step reaches your height, look at the skirts that hang brushing the floor. Under that fabric, in the dark, there is a man sweating. He has perhaps been unable to get up for 20 minutes. His shoulders hurt. He cannot see anything, and he continues. It started in the 11th century, and it is not finished yet.